Kelvin, you were the first Labour Member of Parliament to nominate Jeremy. Lately, polling's been a bit rough and a bit difficult. How do you rate his current performance?
Well, I think Jeremy's performance has been first class. You see him in the Commons with the Prime Minister. I think he does brilliantly. His problem has been, of course, that a high proportion of the Parliamentary Labour Party do not support him and didn't vote for him. And of course, he's got serious enmity in the press and media. But I think he's, I think he's brilliant, and I think he'll be a brilliant Prime Minister.
Do you think he's going to go on to win the 2020 election?
I would sincerely hope so. I think we've got 3 years plus to go, and once the EU legislation is out of the way and we can focus on the real issues which divide Labour and Tories, I think Jeremy will come sailing through, because we want more houses, more spending on the hospitals, and a whole range of other issues which will draw millions of working class Labour voters back to Labour, and I think the middle class voters.
Turning to the EU, recent interventions by Blair and Mandelson, how would you say they've helped Labour's by-election chances?
Well, I think they were clearly, obviously intended to damage Labour's chances, and I have absolutely no time for either of them. But I think many people they're so unpleasant that suddenly many people will be just turned off by them and say, well, it's not going to make any difference to my vote. And I hope that people will just reject what they've said and say they're yesterday's people. I didn't like them then, and I certainly don't like them now.
On Brexit, Labour does seem to be in a bit of a tricky spot. Around 65% of our voters voted Remain, but around 70% of our constituencies were for Leave. Is there any way Labour can unite these two very distinct camps?
Well, it is difficult, and I think until the legislation is over and we are finally out of the EU and running our own affairs again, I think it is going to be difficult. But I would say that I would want to go on and argue the case for Britain being independent, running its own affairs in a socialist way. And I've campaigned on the basis that it's anti-democratic, anti-socialist, and we should be running our own affairs as a step towards rebuilding a democratic socialist Britain, and indeed ultimately a democratic socialist world.
Are you concerned or optimistic about the European national elections this year, particularly in France, the Netherlands and Germany?
Well, I think they've got the same sort of problems that we've had. The society is very divided. A lot of ordinary people feel that the elite is not listening to them and has been ignoring them for a long time, particularly working class people, where manufacturing has declined, unemployment's risen, the gulf between the rich and poor has got wider, and people feel they're not being listened to and not being catered for. I think socialist parties and social democratic parties built their power on the basis of working class support, and I mean the broader working class, including white collar workers, teachers, and everybody else, as well as manual workers. And that support has to be rebuilt again behind a party in which they can feel confident and genuinely represents them in their parliaments and pursues their interests.